In this video, I'm going to show you how to code accessible focusable headings with JavaScript step by step. I'm Stephanie and I am an accessibility engineer and instructor. If you've been wondering how to focus headings in an accessible way, then I'm going to show you step by step how to do it. Let's get started. Here we have the source code open. On the left is the HTML and on the right is the preview of the HTML. The first thing we need to do is semantically code our HTML. Here we have our markup, which is comprised of a section element that has 3 children, 1 heading, and 2 paragraphs. We want to focus the heading with JavaScript, but before we do that, we need to add some attributes to it. So if you look at the heading closely, you will notice that it has 2 attributes. Class heading, which is going to be used to reference the element with JavaScript, so that's the easy part. But we also have the tab index -1. Now what the tab index -1 allows us to is programmatically place focus on the heading. And to better understand what that means is there are 2 types of HTML elements. There are interactive elements such as button, form controls, links, basically elements that you can do things with. And they are non-interactive elements or static elements. And those elements are like statues. They don't do anything, they kind of just stay there. I just want to clarify that static elements are still being perceived by screen readers. Now, if you want to add a focus to an interactive element, all you have to do is just use the focus method of the element object with JavaScript. But the problem is if you use the focus method on a static element, it's not going to work unless you use tab index -1. Now, this is kind of like a magic pill that makes this element focusable with JavaScript. That's why we need tab index -1. Now, it is very important that the value of the tab index attribute is set to -1. Do not set it to 0 or a positive integer, because if you do, there are going to be terrible consequences for your code. So just trust me on that. Tab index -1. Get it? Great. All right, now that you have coded your semantic HTML, let's look at the JavaScript. All right, so we have our first line, which is basically getting a reference for the first heading with the class name of heading. And we're fetching it using document.querySelector. Now the second line of our code is we are adding an event listener to the document object. Basically, this says, okay, when DOM content is loaded, execute this piece of code. And we're using an arrow function here. You have probably noticed that a lot of developers use the load browser event instead of the DOM content loaded, but the load event is much slower, whereas the DOM content loaded event is much quicker. So that's why we're using this event type. And then the next we have the arrow function that says, hey, the first heading that we have fetched from the query selector here, please put a focus on that. Okay. Now let's test it to see if it works. And voila, the heading is focused on page load. That is great. Now you might be thinking there is another line of code which I don't understand. So some browsers, such as usually older browsers like Internet Explorer, they would sometimes make those static elements, remember the statues we talked about, the browser would make them tabbable or focusable if they detect the tab index -1. Now, you don't want that because it is really bad user experience for keyboard users or screen reader users. So what this piece of code here does is if it encounters, we basically protecting our code from encountering just badly built browser infrastructure. So basically, once we have focused the heading and the user has moved on the focus from the heading, we want to remove the attribute tab index from the heading. And then we're using in this case, we're using the first heading constant that we have fetched. And then we are listening for the blur event, which blur event basically means, hey, if the focus is no longer on you, do this. And we're using an arrow function that says, okay, remove the attribute of tab index. This way our code is more robust, so you will have fewer bugs, right? But it does make the code more verbose, if you like, because we have the extra line. But personally, I prefer that. So, all right. So we have written our JavaScript, we have written our HTML, everything is working great, but we have one more step left. Now, can you guess what step that is? And I'll give you a hint. What is one of the most important things of accessibility engineering? And that's right, testing with assistive technology. So before we can ship the code, or before we can set our pull request for review, we need to test that it actually works with a screen reader. So we're going to go back to the browser, and I'm going to turn on my screen reader. Now I am on a Mac, so the screen reader will be VoiceOver. All right, now that we have our screen reader, we need to think of what we wanted our code to do. So we want the focus to land on the heading on page load. So what we're going to do is we're going to refresh the page.
We are a community organization that brings together heading level 1, the pointy end, fencing club.
And there we go. The code is working, the screen reader test is positive, and we are good to go. We have finished writing our code. Now that we have made our code accessible, test with a screen reader, now it's time to celebrate. And there you have it. In just a few steps, you can code accessible, focusable headings with JavaScript. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video if you like it. And thank you for wanting to make the world more accessible. See you next time.